The Longships. Part 2. In King Ethelred's Kingdom. Chapter 1. Concerning the battle that was fought at MALDON, and what came after it. That spring many ships were timbered along the coasts of the northern countries, and keels were pitched, which had long lain dry. Bays and sounds vomited forth navies, with kings and their wrath aboard, and when summer came, there was great unrest upon the seas. Styrbjorn rode early up through the eastern sea, with many ships and men from Jomsborg, Bornholm, and Scania. He put into Lake Mälaren, and came at length to the plain before Uppsala, where he and King Eric joined battle. There he fell in the first moments of the fight, and men say that he died laughing. For when he saw the battle array of the Swedes move forward, drawn up in the ancient manner behind horses' heads borne high upon pikes, with King Eric seated in the midst of his army in an old sacred ox chariot, he threw his head back in a wild frenzy of laughter. In the same instant, a spear came between his beard and the rim of his shield, and took him in the throat. When his followers saw this happen, their courage broke, and many of them fled there and then, so that King Eric won a great victory. Then King Sven Forkbeard rode down through the Danish islands with ships from Fun and Jutland to take King Harald as the latter sat counting on his herring tax at Skanor. For King Sven had at last lost patience at his father's unwillingness to die. But King Harald fled to Bornholm and gathered his ships there, and sharp encounters were fought between these two, until at length King Harald took refuge in his fortress at Jomsborg, sorely wounded. Then much of the Danish kingdom was split with strife, for some men held King Harald's cause to be just, and some King Sven's. Others preferred to fend for themselves, and better their own fortunes, while the land lay lawless under its warring kings. But when the summer stood in its flower, King Eric of Uppsala came sailing southwards, with the greatest army that the Swedes had embarked in any man's memory, driving before him the remnants of Styrbjorn's fleet, which had been harrying his coasts and plundering his villages in revenge for their chieftain's death. King Eric had a mind to punish both King Harald and King Sven for the aid that they had lent to Styrbjorn, and many men thought it an unrewarding prospect to oppose the man who had conquered Styrbjorn, and who was already being called the Victorious. He pursued King Sven to his islands and beyond to Jutland, leaving his own jarls to rule the places through which he had passed. Soon the rumour spread that King Harald had died of his wounds at Jomsborg, a landless refugee, deserted by the luck that had hitherto favoured all his enterprises. But the other two kings continued to war against each other. King Eric held the upper hand, but King Sven resisted him stubbornly. Men reported that the royal castle at Jellinge changed hands every few weeks, King Sven and King Eric taking it in turns to occupy King Harald's old bedchamber. But it was generally agreed that King Sven was the more likely to have arrived first at his father's treasure chests. But in Scania there were many chieftains who felt little inclined to involve themselves in this war of kings, thinking it better to let them settle their own differences, so that honest men might be left to occupy themselves with more profitable undertakings. One such was Thorkel the Tall, who had no desire to serve King Sven, and was still less anxious to find himself a minor thane of King Eric. So he sent word to other thanes and chieftains that he had a mind to fare forth that summer to Frisia and England, if he could find sufficient good men willing to accompany him. Many thought this a good scheme, for Thorkel was an admired chieftain, and his luck was held to be excellent, ever since he had succeeded in escaping with his life from the battle at Jorundfjord. Masterless men of Styrbjorn's army, who had managed to evade King Eric's clutches, also came to join him, and before long he was lying at anchor in the sound off the island of Ven, with 22 ships. But he did not as yet reckon himself sufficiently strong to fare forth. Among those who had joined his banner was Orm Tostason, known as Red Orm, from the Mound in Scania. He had brought with him a large and well-manned ship. Thorkel remembered him from the Christmas feast at King Harald's castle, and welcomed him joyfully. It had so turned out with Orm that he had quickly wearied of sitting at home and arranging the affairs of cattle and farmhands, and he had found it difficult to live peacefully with Asa, though she did her best to make him happy, for she still regarded him as a half-grown boy and fussed continually over him with motherly counsel, as though he lacked the sagacity to manage things for himself. He did his best to explain to her that he had, for some years, been accustomed to deciding the affairs of other men as well as his own, but this information did not appear to impress her, nor did her zealous endeavors to convert him to her new religion and find him a wife improve his humor. The news of King Harald's death had come as a great relief to them both. For when Asa had first learned the truth about how Toke had got his woman, she had been overcome with terror, and had been convinced that there was nothing for it but to sell the house and flee to the estate she had inherited from her father in the forests on the Smaland border, where even King Harald's arm would scarcely be able to reach them. Her fear had been ended by the news of King Harald's death, but Orm could not keep his thoughts from Ylva, and he worried more about her safety than about his own. Often he wondered what had become of her when her father had died, whether King Sven had taken her under his wing as a prospective wife for one of his berserks, or whether perhaps she had fallen into the hands of the Swedes, the thought of which troubled him no less. Since he was on evil terms with King Sven, he could not think of any way in which he might regain her for himself, least of all while war was raging through and around the islands. He said nothing about Ylva to Asa, for he had no wish to listen to the fruitless advice he knew she would immediately shower upon him. But he profited little thereby, for Asa knew several maidens in the district who would admirably suit his needs, and their mothers, being of the same mind as she, brought them to the house, and displayed them newly washed, with their plaits fastened with red silk ribbons. The maidens came willingly, and sat high-bosomed, a-clink with ornaments, shooting large-eyed glances at him. But he showed no enthusiasm for any of them, for none of them resembled Ylva, nor was as witty and as ready-tongued as she was, so that in the end Asa grew impatient with him, and thought that even Odd had hardly been more difficult to please. When, therefore, the news came that Thorkel intended to fare forth a Viking, Orm lost no time in procuring himself a good ship, and hiring men from the district to come with him, paying little heed to Asa's tears and entreaties. Everybody knew him to be a widely travelled man who had returned with much gold from his voyage, so that he found little difficulty in assembling a good crew. He told Asa that he did not expect to be away for as long this time as when he had previously set forth, and promised her that when he returned he would settle down to a peaceful life and take up farming in earnest. Asa wept and protested that she could not endure such sorrow and loneliness, but Ormond assured her that she would live much longer than he, and would help to birch his children and his grandchildren to boot. But this only caused her to weep the more bitterly. So they parted, and Orm sailed to join Thorkel. While Thorkel was still lying off Ven, waiting for a favourable wind, a fleet of 28 ships came rowing up from the south, and from their banners and the cut of their sterns it was apparent that they were Swedish. The weather was calm and good for fighting, and both sides made ready for battle. But Thorkel shouted across the water to the strangers, proclaiming his identity and stating that he wished to speak with their chieftain. The Swedes were under the command of 2 chieftains, of equal sway. One was called Jostein, a man from Uppland, and the other Gudmund, an East Gute. They said they had come to help King Eric plunder in Denmark, and asked what more he wished to know. "If our fleets join battle," shouted Thorkel, "there will be little booty for the winners, and many men will be killed on both sides. I tell you this, though, I am the more likely to prevail." "We have 5 ships more than you," roared the strangers. "That may be," replied Thorkel, "but mine are all picked men, and we have just eaten our morning meal, while your men are weary from rowing, which makes a man less skilful with his spear and sword. But I have a better suggestion to make, which would redound to the advantage of us all, for I can name a more rewarding place than Denmark to go a Viking in." "We have come to aid King Eric," shouted the Uplander. "I do not doubt it," replied Thorkel, "and if I join battle with you, I shall have given good aid to King Sven. But if, instead of fighting each other, we join forces and sail together to lands ripe for plunder, we shall have served our kings just as usefully as if we stay and battle it out here. For in either case, none of us will take any further part in this war, and the difference will be that, if we do as I suggest, we shall all still be alive, with much fine booty waiting for us to come and collect it." "You use words skilfully," said Gudmund. "There is wisdom in what you say, and I think we might profitably continue this discussion at closer quarters." "I know from report that you are both noble chieftains and honourable men," said Thorkel. "Therefore I am not afraid that you will act treacherously if we meet to debate the matter." "I know your brother Sigvald," said Jostein, "but I have often heard it said that you, Thorkel, are of stouter metal than he." So they agreed to meet on the island to debate the matter, on the beach at the foot of a cliff, in sight of the ships. Jostein and Gudmund were each to bring 3 men with them, and Thorkel 5, bringing swords but no casting weapons. This was done, and from the ships the men of the opposing fleets marked how, at first, the chieftains kept their distance from each other, with their men standing close behind them. Then Thorkel ordered ale to be offered to the Swedes, together with pork and bread, and soon they were seen to sit down in a circle and talk as friends. The more Jostein and Gudmund considered Thorkel's proposition, the more excellent it appeared to them to be, and before long Gudmund was anxiously supporting it. Jostein at first held out against it, saying that King Eric had a savage memory for men who betrayed his trust in them. But Thorkel regaled them with the details of the splendid plunder that awaited sea rovers in the islands of the west, and Gudmund reckoned that they could worry about King Eric's memory when the time came. Then they came to an agreement regarding the division of command during the voyage, and how the booty was to be shared out, so that no disputes should arise later, and Gudmund observed that so much meat and talk gave a man a fine thirst, and praised the excellence of Thorkel's ale. Thorkel shook his head, and said that it was, in truth, the best that he could offer them for the moment, but that it was nothing compared with the ale in England, where the best hops in the world grew. Then even Jostein had to agree that this sounded like a land worth voyaging to. So they took each other by the hand, and swore to be faithful, and to keep their word. Then, when they had returned to their ships, 3 sheep were slaughtered over the bows of each chieftain's vessel, as a sacrifice to the sea people for weather luck and good voyage. All the crews were well satisfied with the agreement that their chieftains had made, and Thorkel's reputation, which was already great in the eyes of his men, waxed because of the wisdom he had displayed in this matter. Several more ships came to join Thorkel, from Scania and Holland, and when at last a favourable wind arose, the fleet put forth, 55 sails strong, and spent the autumn plundering in Frisia, and wintered there. Orm inquired of Thorkel and the others of his comrades whether they knew of what had become of King Harald's household. Some said they had heard that Jellinge had been burned, others that Bishop Poppo had calmed the sea with psalms and escaped by ship, though King Sven had done his best to catch him. But none of them knew what had happened to the king's women. In England, things were beginning to be as they had been in the old days, in the times of the sons of Ragnar Harrybreeks, for King Ethelred had come to the throne. He had not long come of age and taken the reins of government into his own hands before men began to call him the Irresolute, or the Raidless, and honest seafarers from the north flocked joyfully to his coasts to give him the chance to justify his reputation. At first they came in small bodies and were easily repelled. Beacons were lit along the coasts to signify their arrival, and stout warriors armed with broad shields rushed to meet them and drive them back into the sea. But King Ethelred yawned at his table and offered up prayers against the Northmen, and lay cheerfully with his chieftains' women. He screamed with rage when they brought word to him in his boudoir that in spite of his prayers the long ships had returned. He listened, fatigued, to much counsel, and complained loudly at being thus inconvenienced, and otherwise did nothing. Then the invaders began to arrive more frequently and in stronger companies, till the king's levies became inadequate to deal with them, and the larger bands of them would sometimes drive deep inland and return to their ships bent double under the weight of their booty. And the word spread abroad, and many believed it, that no kingdom could now compare with King Ethelred's in wealth and fatness for valiant seafarers who came in good strength. For it was by now many years since England had been properly plundered, save in her coastal areas. But as yet no large fleet had sailed there, and no chieftains had learned the art of demanding Daingeld in minted silver from King Ethelred's coffins. But in the year of grace 991, both these deficiencies were remedied, and thereafter there was no lack of men willing to be instructed in this art, as long as King Ethelred was there to pay good silver to such as came and asked for it. Soon after the Easter of that year, which was the 5th year after King Ethelred's coming of age, the beacons were lit along the Kentish coasts. Men gazed pale-faced into the morning mists, and turned and ran to hide what they could, and drive their cattle into the forests, and take themselves into hiding with them. And word was sent to King Ethelred and his jarls, as fast as horse could ride, that the biggest fleet that had been sighted for many years was rowing along his coasts, and that the heathens had already begun to wade ashore. The levies were assembled, but could achieve nothing against the invaders, who split up into powerful bands and plundered the district, gathering into one place everything that they laid their hands on. Then the English fell into a panic, lest they should drive inland, and the Archbishop of Canterbury betook himself in person to the king to crave help for his city. However, after the invaders had enjoyed themselves for a short while in the coastal area and had carried off to their ships everything that they found worth taking, they embarked again and sailed away up the coast. Then they landed in the country of the East Saxons and did likewise there. King Ethelred and his archbishop, whose name was Sigeric, promptly offered up longer prayers than ever, and when they heard that the heathens, after sacking a few villages, had put out to sea again, they had rich gifts distributed among those priests who had prayed most assiduously, believing themselves to be rid at last of these unwelcome visitors. No sooner had this been done than the Vikings rode into a town called MALDON, at the mouth of the river Pant, pitched camp on an island in the middle of the estuary, and prepared to assault the town. The Jarl of the East Saxons was called Byrhnoth. He had a great name in his country, and was bigger than other men, and very proud and fearless. He assembled a powerful army and marched against them, to see whether blows might prove more effectual than prayers against the invaders. On reaching MALDON, he marched past the town toward the Vikings' camp until only the arm of the river separated the two forces. But now it was difficult for him to attack the Vikings, and equally difficult for them to attack him. The tide came in, filling the river arm to the level of its banks. It was no broader than a spear's throw, so that the armies were able to hail one another, but it did not appear as though they would be able to come to close grips. So they stood facing each other in merry spring weather. A herald of Thorkel the Toll's army, a man skilled in speech, stepped forward to the river's edge, raised his shield, and cried across the water, "The seamen of the north, who fear no man, bid me address you thus. Give us silver and gold, and we will give you peace. You are richer than we, and it will be better for you to buy peace with the tribute than to meet men of our mettle with spear and sword. If you have wealth enough, it will not be necessary for us to kill each other. Then when you have bought your freedom, and freedom for your families, and your houses, and all that you possess, we shall be your friends, and will return to our ships with your freeing money, and will sail away from this place, and will remain faithful to our word." But Byrhnoth himself stepped forward, and brandishing his spear, roared back, "Hearken well, sea rover, to our reply. Here's all the tribute you will get from us, pointed spears and keen-edged swords. It would be ill become such a jarl as I, Byrhnoth, Byrhthelm's son, whose name is without spot, not to defend my country and the land of my king. This matter shall be settled by point and blade, and hard indeed must you hew before you find aught else in this land." They stood facing each other until the tide turned and began again to run toward the sea. Then the herald of the Vikings cried across the river, "Now we have stood idle long enough. Come over to us, and we will let you have our soil as battleground. Or if you prefer it, choose a place on your bank, and we will come over to you." Jarl Byrhnoth was unwilling to wade across the river, for water was cold, and he feared lest it might make his men's limbs stiff and their clothing heavy. At the same time, he was eager to join battle before his men should begin to feel tired and hungry. So he cried back, "I will give you good ground here, and do not delay, but come now to fight us, and God alone knows which of us will hold the field." And these are the words of Byrhnoth's bard, who was present at this battle, and escaped with his life. The seamen's army feared not the flood. Blood wolves waded west through Panta. Clear through the current's crystal water bore they their linden shields to the strand. Byrhnoth's men stood awaiting them like a hedge of shields. He had ordered them first to cast their spears, and then to advance with their swords and drive the heathens back into the river. But the Vikings formed into battle order along the bank as they emerged from the water, each ship's crew keeping together, and straightway raised their battle cries and charged, with the captain of each ship running at the head of his crew. A swarm of spears flew toward them, bringing many of them to the ground, whence they did not rise. But they continued to advance relentlessly, until they found themselves shield to shield with the Englishmen. Then there was fierce hewing and loud alarums, and the Vikings' right and left wings were halted and hard pressed. But Thorkel the Tall, and the two captains nearest to him, Orm was one, and the other was Fairwide Svensson, a famous chieftain from Zealand, whom King Harald had proclaimed outlaw throughout the Danish kingdom, and who had fought with Styrbjorn at the battle on Fyris Plain before Uppsala, assaulted Byrhtnoth's own phalanx and broke it. Thorkel cried to his men to fell the tall man in the silver helmet, for then the day would be theirs. Straightway the fighting became fiercest in this part of the field, and there was little elbow room for men of small stature. Fairwide hewed his way forward, slew Byrhtnoth's standard-bearer, and aimed a blow at Byrhtnoth, wounding him, but he fell himself in the same instant with a spear through his beard. Many of the chieftains on both sides were killed, and Orm slipped on a fallen shield that was greasy with blood, and tumbled headlong over the body of a man he had just slain. As he fell, he received a blow on the back of his neck from a club, but at once those of his men who were closest to him threw their shields over his body to cover him and protect his back. When he regained his senses and was able, with Rapp's assistance, to get to his feet again, the battle had moved away from that part of the field, and the Vikings had gained the upper hand. Byrhtnoth had fallen, and many of his men had fled, but others had formed themselves into a tight ring, and, though surrounded, were still resisting valiantly. Thorkel shouted to them over the noise of the battle that he would spare their lives if they cast down their arms, but the cry came back from their midst, "The fewer we be, the fiercer we shall hew, and the shrewder shall be our aim, and our courage crueller." They fought on until all lay dead upon the ground, together with many of their foemen, about their chieftain's corpse. The Vikings marveled at the valor of these Englishmen, praising the dead. Nevertheless, this battle at MALDON, fought 3 weeks before Whitsun in the year 991, was a grievous setback for King Ethelred, and a disaster for his realm. For now, far and wide about them, the land lay helpless before the fury of the invaders from the north.